Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much to the organizers for having put together such an amazing summer school, so far at least. Let's see if I can keep it that way. And of course, for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you to the interpreters. I know this is a terribly tough job. I promise I will try, I will do my best to speak slowly and clearly. Forgive me if I don't succeed at times. Well, finally, I know it's a tough time slot for you, but also for me. So let's hang in there together, stand in solidarity, and go through this together again. So that's it. And what do I want to do in this lecture, or better, what I'm trying? I will try to do. It's to basically provide a few elements to critically interpret what can be called the great divergence, which means this idea that there is a constitutive alterity between the social question and environmental issues. To be very brief, by social question, I refer to the set of discourses, practices, objective determinations, and subjective dispositions which relate to the capital-labor divide and which have defined to a certain and profound effect, degree modernity. Whereas with environmental issue or the question concerning ecology, I do refer to the set of discourses, theories, practices, objective determinations, and subjective dispositions, which relate to environmental problems as side effects of industrial development, both in the north and in the south. Industrial development, which is, at least in my view, not just in my view, but in the view I subscribe to, as driven by the relationship, the conflictual, but also constitutively, potentially complicit relationship between the actors of the social question, namely the working class and the capitalist class. So this great divergence basically is what I want to interpret and criticize. And to begin, to introduce this, I take a line from a novel, which I enjoyed quite a lot, by Simona Baldanzi. She's an Italian novelist. And this novel, which is titled Figlia di una vestaglia blu, the daughter of a blue vest, and blue vests were the uniforms of workers, mostly women, at the rifle factory in Mugello, which is an area of Tuscany in Italy. And basically, the book itself is about two different ways of belonging, feeling one's belongingness to the working class. One is a middle-aged woman, which is the mother of the author, working in a factory, and the other one is a young construction worker who's there, is from the south, is there to build facilities for high-speed trains, okay? And so there is a first line of tension between, let's say, the old blue-collar traditional working class and the new precarious working class. But in that, like, you know, in the book, there's also a lot of environmental issues, and at a certain point, the author goes to a demonstration against the high-speed train. She's very clear in saying she agrees with the environmentalist critique of high-speed facilities, but then she voices also a frustration, okay, talking with these young workers, saying when they talk about the environment, they don't consider labor. The two things are so detached from one another that it's painful, because those two things are actually one. And basically, in the end, if I can convince you that she's right, I've done my job properly, and if not, let's discuss. As I said before, the polemical objects are this great divergence, and I have organize three different forms of this. One, oh no, sorry, this is the outline. Next slide, the polemical object. So what I'm doing, 5 minutes, in this lecture, basically the first part, which is the longer, I will discuss three different forms of the great divergence. I will try to say why, in my opinion, those are insightful, but ultimately unsatisfactory. And then I will provide a few basic definitions of the notion of working class ecology through Stefania Barca and noxiousness through Lorenzo Feltrin and Devi Sacchetto, to basically say that, at least with the focus on the Italian situation between the 60s and the 70s, I do think that environmental issues and the social question are intimately related in such a way that actually these the environmental issues constitute an expansion or an enlargement of the social question, a very historically determinate one. So I will try to show the role played by the labor movement in Italy in providing, in producing a politicization of ecology. I will try then to show how, even at the international level, when it comes to international law, this conflictuality performed by the working class had effects up to a certain point, but that in the 90s, this effect basically ceased. There has been a historical failure of the great Fordist cycle of mobilization. And what we had instead was the emergence of a capitalist attempt to incorporate the environmental limit as an element for a new and unprecedented strategy of accumulation, okay, from the 90s onwards, up to when, let's debate about this. But my point in the second part is that both just transition, we have talked about that yesterday, we'll talk about that tomorrow more in depth, and climate justice, at first, in their emergence, deal with that situation. Like, the protagonist of that story at that point was capital. And they then, in my opinion, at the very least, developed from a defensive attitude at first to a more radical agenda, or, as I say here, potentially and hopefully emancipatory strategies today. So I conclude part two by saying that, in my opinion, right now, the conditions are proper to elaborate on and produce in practice a convergence between just transition as a union strategy and climate justice as a form of political engagement of social movements. And part three, I will provide a few elements about this case study which Bue yesterday mentioned, which is the ex-GKN factory in Campi Bisenzio near Florence, which is right now, which has been occupied for 2 years. So the three forms of the great divergence. The first one is what I call environmentalist conventional wisdom, and the main point is that the social question is considered to be indifferent to environmental issues. They are different things and they don't relate to each other. Then I go, more little thing. I am a sociologist, so the second point, critical social theory, I pick authors, specifically Ulrich Beck, Donatella Della Porta, and Bruno Latour, because I am a sociologist. I hope there are interdisciplinary implications in my reasoning, but still, you can find similar structures of reasoning in other disciplines, in geography, in philosophy, and stuff like that. So I hope that's relevant to whatever discipline you are in. Okay. So basically the main point of this one, and we'll see it, is that ecology and class are different, but not just different. They belong to different historical phases, which means that the centrality of one necessarily implies the marginalization of the other one. and then we'll see how historically they see this alterity playing out. And then, finally, I will briefly discuss the post-materialist thesis by Ronald Inglehart, and sociologically speaking, we can talk about the ecological modernization theory. And what is interesting here is that they agree that there is an alterity between class and ecology, and that there is an historical substitution of the first with regard to the second, but at the same time, this substitution is reversible. And I think this is relevant for our discussion because it explains, or it may help in explaining why there is an objective tendency, although for the moment it's being kept at bay, but some people in our research community in Italy, and not only in Italy, are right now working on something they call the labels negationism, denialism, and you can apply this to different fields, in the sense that, of course, in a capitalist system, since the working class for its reproduction relies on wages, they have an objective interest in keeping the wage system on, although at the same time, they are in the position to critically undermine it. So let's go quickly through each of these forms. The first one, I won't spend much time on it. I think this view can be is vehicled by many authors, so I don't quote any specifically, but the main idea is environmental issues emerge as side effects of industrial development, so they are a phenomenon specific to the 20th century, and in the second part especially, rightly so, I would say there is implied in this view a differentiation between environmental degradation, which is something which pertains a dysfunction in the nature society link, and that as such can happen in many points in history and in geography, dysfunctions in the society-nature relationship, whereas ecological crisis is something related to industrial development. Then, in this view, industrial development isn't necessarily linked to a class-based society. So industry is the main character of this story, not capital. But still, there is a difference between what we have experienced since the second half of the 20th century in terms of environmental issues and environmental issues before that. So a new phenomenology of problems linked to the environment emerged in the second half of the 20th century. Careful, sensitive, concerned scientists are the first to detect this negative novelty. And here the main character is Rachel Carson, but then of course the Meadows in the Limits to Growth, and we can add others. So they are in the position to see what the rest of society doesn't see. Okay? They explain, they teach, they educate the rest of society. After some years, the rest of society, apparently in the 80s, recognize that they were right. And so, supposedly, everyone was in the position to solve the problem once it was seen. And environmentalism, in this view, emerges in the 80s after the great cycle of Fordist mobilization, precisely in response to the fact that the previous conflicts, being class-based, were blind to environmental issues. Once environmental issues emerge and you realize that they are there, you don't have to conflict on the basis of class belonging, because you first have to solve the ecological crisis. We have seen something like that in the first phase of Extinction Rebellion. Gender issues are there, racialization issues are there, class issues are there, but you can confront them only within an habitable planet. So first, let's all together solve climate change, and then we will go back to fighting our either identity politics or class politics or whatever you want. So this is a story of discovering, okay? And then once it is discovered, you go and try to solve them. A little bit more elegant is the position defended by critical sociology since the 80s. I do think that the main author here is Ulrich Beck, but many others have been important. In his book, published originally in Germany in 86, Risikogesellschaft, Beck proposes to distinguish between class situations and risk situations. There is a historical development of these two categories, but the point is, class situations are defined by the positive logics of distribution. Okay, like we are already living in what has been called by Matthias Schmelzer the growth paradigm. So the output, the overall output of production has increased rapidly in the post-World War II situations, especially in Europe. So according to Beck, the main point of the cycle of mobilization in the Fordist regime, let's say late 60s, beginning of the 70s, concern who should benefit from the productivity gains that they had produced before in the 60s and early, in the 50s and the early 60s. So like, you know, there is an excess, and those struggle concern who gets that surplus, okay? Whereas in the 80s, in accordance with the environmentalist awareness, the environmental concerns and the awareness spreading in society, we see the emergence of risk situations, which are conversely defined by a negative logic of disposal rejection. So if in the previous cycle they wanted something, right now they want to get rid of something, according to Beck. And the main point is not really what and how to get, but how do we define what we want to get rid of, okay? So basically the whole book is about, let's see which social dynamics like determine what a risk is, knowing full well that a risk is not an essence, okay? What is risky for you may not be risky for me. What is risky in Germany may not be risky in the UK and stuff like that. So like, you know, you have the reflection on uncertainty. And again, uncertainty here is supposed to be the opposite of the, we don't know why, but they think that was the case, of the clarity of the scenario in the Fordist period. Okay, according to Beck and later on according to Latour, in the 60s, there was no discussion about what to produce, how to produce it, when, for whom, where. So what we can call the qualitative composition of production. Okay, the only point was once production is done, who gets the fruit of production? According to Beck, right now we are in a different situation. Okay, so risk situations imply the marginalization, like, you know, the decreasing importance of class situations. And then he would say in a subsequent book, not in Risikogesellschaft, but I think this quote is very relevant. Beck says, what relations of production in the capitalist society represented for Karl Marx, relations of definition represent for a risk society. So the point is, who has the power to impose its view on risk? So you see, to conclude, class, labor and ecology are two different things. The fact that ecology is important implies the fact that labor is less important than it was before. And according to Beck, this is a positive development, both in 1986 and in 2009. Not that Beck is an optimistic sociologist. Like he says, there are a lot of problems within a risk society, but those problems cannot be solved if we assume class structure as a starting point. Okay, so it's not a matter of who has the power in terms of income or determining the economy. Similarly, I'll try to go quick. The theory of new social movements incorporate this view. For example, Mario Diani in a very important book, I don't know if it has been translated into English in 1988. It's the first important study of the environmentalist movement in Italy. And basically the main point is, in Italy, environmentalist movements are spreading later than they were in Germany because trade unions, class-based trade unions were stronger in Italy than in Germany. So they have blocked an environmentalist concerns and environmental awareness to spread in Italy. And again, the point is, it's not just that environmental issues are indifferent or independent from class situations, but that they emerge in spite of those. And if you want, let's say, it is now I refer to the very last book Latour produced with Nikolai Schulz, and the title in English is On the Emergence of an Ecological Class, a Memo. In my opinion, this formulation is surprising, not because of what it says, because it's basically a variation on the same main point Beck was elaborating already in the 80s. It is very surprising because it has been written in late 2021, okay? I do believe that up until 2009, like, before the crisis in 2007, 2008, there were material conditions that accounted for this kind of reflections to be cogent. Like, there was a reality they were describing, okay? Politically problematic, like we can discuss about, which kind of tools it provided political struggles with, but as descriptions, there was something like that going on, in my opinion. In 2021, after the crisis, after the anti-austerity cycle of mobilization erupted, after the yellow vests in France, it's less understandable that these kind of positions are defended. But again, the point in Latour and Schulz is the ecological class is not defined in structural terms. Those who belong to the ecological class subscribe discursively to the idea that the main political divide of our time is not that between those who owns the means of production and those who don't, okay? But those who want the conditions of habitability of the planet to be preserved, and those who don't care. So his call to the Green parties basically is, be a transversal party, okay? If they are not in bad faith, everybody, capitalists and workers alike, women and black people alike, they have an objective interest in preserving the planet, and you are the party which wants to represent this class, which is formed purely on discursive basis. So if you read the book by Latour and you are a peasant, yesterday one peasant was here, so this person reads the book by Latour and Schulz and decides he or she is convinced, then he or she belongs to the ecological class. Okay, this is how it works, and it is. I'm not making a caricature here. Like, the book is says that plainly. Then, super quickly, because if not, we don't have time. The third form is probably the most famous. It has been renownedly criticized by Martine Salier in Ecology of the Poor. But here what is interesting to me is that in Ingelhardt's elaboration, the fact that environmental issues emerge independently from class situations is based on the idea that in order, it's a hierarchy of needs, okay? Once you have satisfied your basic needs, then you have time to pay attention to other problems, which are less important, of course, and then you have politics, you can have interest for international situations, like, you know, when human rights are not respected, and so on and so forth. But again, what seems to me relevant and worthy of reconsideration in these ideas is that it is accounted for something like irreversibility, okay? Once your basic needs are no longer satisfied, then you don't pay attention any longer to environmental issues, identity politics, human rights, and stuff like that. And I would say that in Southern Europe, where I am from, the collapse of the middle class or the intermediate strata is showing a process which is readable through these lenses, okay? So our problem within social movements is to show that this way of putting things is only partially correct, and there is an objective interest, if you want, in working class politics or politics from below to incorporate environmental issues. But, I mean, that this is insightful, that Latour, Beck, Della Porta, Diani, and others provide good analysis, I wouldn't question. Yet, my point is that they are ultimately unsatisfactory for two main reasons. One is historical. Like, you know, it is true that now my focus is in Italy, and let me just say is on Italy. Let me acknowledge the limitation of my research. Like, you know, I'm discussing general points, but in the end, my focus, historically speaking, is mostly on Italy and a little bit on the US. At the same time, I perceive my research to be a piece in a mosaic of critical thinking. So the focus on something doesn't imply that the rest is less important than that something. That something was important for me to elaborate a reflection, which I think, I think it is important. Maybe you disagree, but again, like, it's not something that it's either what I say or what others say. I try to assume a collaborative attitude in my work, and I hope it is shown in what I'm saying. But at least with regard to Italy, it is actually problematic to state that environmental issues, or better, attention to environmental issues emerged after the cycle of mobilizations in the Fordist factories. Actually, I do think that it is true that the spread, it became a generalized phenomenon in the 80s, and the main subjects, like the class composition of the environmentalist movement in Italy, as in other countries, is mostly middle class, intermediate strata. But the origin of that shift through which environmental issues became object of public attention is intimately linked to struggles within the factory, as I'll try to show. But even politically and theoretically, it is unsatisfactory, because if we agree with this, then even today, there is no point in trying to elaborate a class perspective on ecology, because if you assume that the problem is industry or industrial development, then there is only one objective. Like, you know, there's no politics at all. The point is, let's solve that, which means let's stop polluting, emitting, and this and that. And also the problem of who brought us in this mess becomes irrelevant. Because once the problem is there, it's just reasonable to say, first you solve the problem and then we see who was responsible. Whereas, of course, in my opinion, knowing who's being responsible, is key to understand what to do to solve the problem and prevent the problem itself to present again in the future. So what I'm going to do in this last part of the first part is to go quickly, but again, right now I really go quickly, because I'm sure most of the stuff I'm saying is common knowledge here. But the point is, Stefania Barca makes a lot of nice points in her work, but here, basically, she says the factory is an ecosystem, and the working class is the subject who knows best that ecosystem. You don't solve the ecological crisis without transforming that ecosystem. So there is a positionality at play. Okay, the ecological crisis look different if you are unemployed, if you are a blue collar, if you are a peasant, and then different again if you are a capitalist or if you are something else. Again, the point Stefania Barca makes, the one is useful for me here, is that in Italy, working class struggles against noxiousness, and I'll define that in a sec, were the first to establish that the job blackmail, the idea that if you want your wage, you have to be silent about what is produced in that factory, and if that production is harmful for your health, that's your decision, either wage or health, is not the only way labor and ecology can interact. Well, noxiousness is the property of causing harm. Lorenzo Feltrini and Debbie Sacchetto have written an amazing article on that. What I want to show, the visuals here, not the painting, which is by Pia Valentinis, but like this one, the previous one, and the other two slides, they come from a self-produced textbook on health and safety by workers in Turin in the painting units of Fiat manufacturing. Fiat used to produce cars. Right now, it would take us too far away from the lecture to see what Fiat or FCA or Stellantis is doing. But the point is, for them, noxiousness has 4 dimensions. Light, noise, stuff like that is the first. Gases, fumes, vapors are the second. Then you have physical fatigue as the third. And quite importantly, for our purposes, is that the fourth factor of noxiousness is excessive rhythm, ergonomic nuisance, anxiety. And of course, this all together, for example, in Italy, the movement for workers with a class-sensitive ecology were very linked to the movement for a class-based view on mental health, for example. So, it would. In any case, the point Feltrini and Sacchetto make is that you don't get an attention on environmental issues in Italy without the centrality of the workers' experience of ecology in the factory, in a capitalist economy. So the idea is the link between labor and ecology is expressed in noxious forms because we are in a capitalist economy. Okay, that was. And then, many cases, the most famous ones are the Fiat painting units and Porto Marghera Petrochemicals Montedison in close to Venice. But again, I think it is reasonable, even from a historical perspective, to say that in Italy, at the very least, the politicization of the ecological crisis happens thanks to, not in spite of, the labor movement and its struggles. Okay, this is the way public opinion in Italy starts considering environmental issues as political problems. And this is important, of course, in our discussion, because not just in Italy, of course, you had this kind of situations, but it changes the way we think about today's connection between labor and ecology. It is relevant, in my opinion, to assess that the rediscovery of this initial link between labor and ecology, not in as opposed terms, but as something which was intimately linked, emerged in Italy first in popular culture and only very recently in academic research and public discussion. This is I'll show you very quickly two graphic novels. This one is by Pia Valentinis, and the translation would be Still Plant, based in Trieste. So maybe it's very close to here. And this one, even before 2009, Davide Reviati, Dead Sleep. And you see the six-legged dog, the symbol of Eni, the Italian big player in the energy sector and petrols and fossil fuels. These novels, but then also songs and other books, are all about this tension between generations, the fathers in the factory, knowing full well the factory is noxious, but being, well, it's difficult for them to imagine something different than that. And the sons, which are, for them, it's very easy to imagine something different, but they don't have the money, the social security to actually perform that. So if you want, those are two forms of the separation. And that separation played historically in different ways in the 60s, 70s, and right now, but is, in my opinion, linked to the structural ambivalence of the workers' condition within a capitalist economy. Mario Tronti, in my opinion, has expressed that in the best form in Workers and Capital, and he says basically, objectively, labor power, labor counts, work counts twice in capitalism. As labor power, objectively, it is an element of capital. But subjectively, as working class, as organized working class, it can play a role against capital. So if this duplicity is the trait, the common trait, every time we talk about, in a capitalist society, the link between labor and ecology, we will find this contradiction, this duplicity. But historically, struggles have determined the shift from up until the mid-60s, the normal way in Italy to, from a trade union perspective, to deal with the link labor-ecology was the so-called risk monetization. Okay, so workers knew that chimney is noxious. So they go through their unions, they negotiate, they bargain, and they say, we want more money. We want, to scale up in the hierarchy of employment and stuff like that. So the point is not to eliminate the source of harm, but to translate that into either money or status or access to X, okay? And this is clearly a subaltern way to incorporate labor into ecology or ecology into trade union politics, which was possible in what we called, what Matthias Schmetzer called the growth paradigm. Later on, when struggles intensified, late 60s, beginning of the 70s, what we had instead of risk monetization was, let's say, the general framework is the primacy of health of those who work and of those who live close to noxious facilities, okay? So health becomes something non-negotiable. There's no way you can compensate for a loss of health. And then the workers' movement divided into two strands. I don't have time to go deep in that, but for some, the main point was to liberate wage work. So basically to stay within the wage form, but to increase a workers' power. For others, the idea is that you have to destroy the wage form in order for ecological issues to be properly managed from a worker's perspective. And this tension actually, in my opinion, is part of the reasons why the potentials for emancipatory politics of this way to relate labor and ecology didn't succeed. It ultimately failed as an experiment, but then that we can discuss. In any case, failure or not failure, what the point I want to make is the fact that workers struggled about ecological issues for a significant amount of time, not just in Italy, of course, had an effect on international politics. Of course, I will be assertive from now on, but the point is, if we assume as a symbolic dates, 72, limits to growth, and then 85, 87 with the Vienna Convention on ozone layer depletion, and then the Montreal Protocol, which basically said, we know there are some substances which create a problem like ozone layer depletion. Science is supposedly clear and unified in this, so let's ban these substances. And that's what they did, basically. And surprisingly, it worked. But from an international perspective, the form of the linked labor ecology was either or, which means either you privilege growth or capitalist development, but then you sacrifice environmental protection, or you privilege environmental protection, but in so doing, you harm economic growth or capitalist development. This is why international environmental politics has been framed in this period as sectoral. So it was a small part of the policy arena in general. It worked in that small part. But since it wasn't a generalized structure to, a vision, a common vision for policies in different sectors, of course, it worked in a very small part of the economy. The rest didn't really take ecology into account. Again, assertively, this changes significantly starting from the late 80s in connection with the losing of, with the decrease in workers' power in societies, at the very least in Europe and the US. And you have, again, symbolic data, symbolic dates of this are 1987 with when sustainable development as a concept is coined. And then, of course, much more in the 90s, starting from the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And you see, this has been an important innovative, conceptual innovation from the capitalist perspective. In my opinion, very important, because the ecological crisis ceases to be seen as a crisis of capitalism and starts to be seen as a crisis for capitalism. Okay, so the idea is that the environmental limit is no longer an obstacle to development, but it can be a driver if properly framed. And the main area in which the main area is climate governance. I'll get there in a sec. Just to say that for this green economy paradigm to emerge, you need to have a sidelining of labor and its representation. So if you want, schematically, in the Fordist period, you had a growth strategy based on a partial reduction of inequality in the global north, okay, at the expenses of the sphere of reproduction and within this of the environment. Again, for this structure to happen, you need to have an unbalanced world system. Okay, so for that growth strategy, which would imply a reduction of inequalities in the north, you had a deepening of inequalities in the global south. And this is something we should take into account. But the idea was growth plus equality, and the problem is the environment. The wager of the green economy is to say, no, okay, let's try to base the growth strategy onto environmental protection, and of course, the victim will be equality. And we had that, the subject of the green economy is the self-entrepreneur, smart, enlightened, very quick in seizing innovation as opportunities, but most importantly, no institutional mediation. At the social level, no unions. At the democratic level, no parliaments, basically. The decrease in the relevance of parliament is, can be seen also from an environmental perspective. So then we have the main policy area in which the green economy is incorporated is climate governance. The main idea here is, yeah, okay, global warming is a market failure because historically it was unable to account properly for negative externalities, in this case, CO2 equivalent emissions. But we can solve the problem also through only through a further wave of marketization. So let's create payment for ecosystem services, carbon trading and stuff like that, or biodiversity offsets and stuff. The point is, the promise, like, you know, this system in the 90s catalyzed a lot of political imagination, also from radical areas. And the twofold promise of this system was, you'll get less emissions and you'll get more profits, okay? So let's judge if they succeeded. Actually, to discuss in detail the economic performance of carbon markets, I mean, it would take a little bit of time to discuss that because it's controversial. When it comes to the reduction of CO2 equivalent emissions, there is no discussion, okay? So you know that the Kyoto Protocol at the baseline year, it was 1990. Right now we know that from 1990 to today, global emissions, like, you know, we have, as a species, emitted half of the carbon dioxide equivalent emitted since, you know, when we have the first estimates, which is the mid-18th century. Okay, so, like, you know, we decided that we had a problem, we decided to have policies to address the problem, and the problem, it's not just not solved, it accelerated incredibly. Okay, so it's not just, I say failure, but we should come up with a better word. The point is, and I run, right now we say it failed. The 90s, the story was different, okay? Because the idea was, we have two actors. Climate governance, they say, yeah, global warming is a problem, let's do something about that. And we have this idea. On the other side, you had climate denialists, okay? So us, this part of the political spectrum, both trade unions and social movements, in this political field, more or less consciously, in my opinion, decided to, you know, accept the fact that they were not the main character, like, you know, they weren't powerful enough to affect the process profoundly, but they decided to, I call it, it could be critical proximity. So we are part of the process and we'll show the limits of the process, because the idea is it's better a small step in the right direction that stay where the right direction is not taken, okay? And right now we know that wasn't the right direction, but back in the day, it was the only game in town and they decided to. So the point is, both just transition, which emerged first, like, you know, as an idea in 1993 in the US with the super fund for workers, and then as a term, it was coined in 1995 by Les Leopold, another American unionist, in connection with the super fund for workers. But the idea is, we don't lead the ecological transition, so labor will be affected negatively by that, but we need to have an ecological transition, so let's try to limit the damage, okay? A defensive position. The same will happen in a second, I'll show you with climate justice, and that's why within the preamble of the Paris Agreement, you have mentions of just transition and climate justice, because this critical proximity was actually capitalized by climate governance as a provision of social legitimation. Okay, so civil society and trade unions are with us in this effort. And the same went with climate justice. The term, the idea emerged in the mid-90s, and the term was coined in 1999. Climate justice, as a quick definition, is that, you know, the idea that more than atmospheric problem, global warming is a matter of inequality, because those who have least, who are responsible the least for the problem are also those who are more affected by the nefarious effects of global warming. Then there are two forms of climate justice. I cannot really describe them, because if not, I cannot talk about GKN, and I want to talk about GKN. But the main point here is, at the beginning, when climate justice was a provider of social legitimation, again, with exception, for example, the Cochabamba People's Conference in 2010, that was a quite radical moment for climate justice, but it didn't last. Okay, it was just after Copenhagen, the failure of 2009, but it didn't last much, and it had no effects on the negotiation for the Paris Agreement. But at first, the only narrative of climate justice was between nations. And you had two possibilities, like, the villain is China if the story is about absolute emissions, and the villain is the US if the story is about relative emissions, per capita emissions. But again, the main characters are states, which means the social question doesn't really play any role in this narrative. Right now, that narrative, which is justified and correct, it should be there, is infused with a little bit of interest in the social question. This is a 2020 graph from Oxfam. I mean, we can discuss the details, but the point is, it encapsulates what, in my opinion, is the rupture provided by the climate strikes in 2019, when, in general, the climate justice movement withdrew the support, the political legitimation it provided the system with. If you look at what Greta Thunberg said in 2018 in Katowice for the Conference of the Parties number 24, she says, you have had 30 years to do something for this. Emissions have kept risen and accelerated the rate of emission themselves. So you have failed. I'm not talking to you. You are not my interlocutor. I'm calling the streets, like people to the streets, because power belongs to people. Like, then we can discuss about Greta Thunberg and whatever. I am a big fanboy. But the point is, objectively, from that moment on, you don't have a climate justice movement supporting the COP system, but you have a climate justice movement criticizing the COP system, and the elite have been quick in getting the point, because after Glasgow, the COP has been in Egypt, and the next one is going to be in the Arab Emirates, which means no protests can happen. Okay, so like, basically is, oh, you don't provide me with legitimation any longer? Okay, we don't need you. What is interesting here is that I think that in this graph, basically you have, instead of states, the main characters of the story are income groups, okay? And so you have a concern with the social question here from the point of view of consumption. So basically this graph says the 1% emits much more because they consume in a worse way from a climate perspective. But what is happening right now, this is the most recent Oxfam report about climate called Carbon Billionaires. Then we can discuss about the statistics here and the way they are produced. But the point is, here we have the point of view of production. So the super rich, it's not just 100 times more, it's 1,000,000 times more in terms of emission rather than the regular person, because they enact a lock-in effect within the fossil economy. Okay, so their investments are dirty from a climate perspective, not their consumption, not their habits, not their lifestyles. So in this scenario, my point is just transition and climate justice emerged in a moment in which the green economy was very powerful as a discourse and very strong in implementing policy. But right now, both within the unions and within the movements, the failure of that system is, in my opinion, the awareness of that failure is widespread. And this changes the situation. In my opinion, in the direction, and this has already happened, again, in my opinion, through a process of progressive radicalization of both actors in JT, in Just Transition, and in climate justice. And then you start to have some examples, case studies of situations in which the convergence between the two occurs. And so, like, the last 10 minutes will be on this. As I said before, Bue already mentioned this case. GKN, is a multinational corporation owned by UK-based hedge fund Melrose Industries, and it produces axle shafts. So it's in the automotive sector. They had in Europe 11 factories when this story starts in July 9, and right now they have 8, because this one closed and other 2 closed. So basically July 9, 2021, during the pandemic, the Italian government enforced a ban on firings. Basically, the idea is, we realize enterprises are having problems because this and that, but they cannot fire people because they are having economic issues due to the pandemic. It ran up until July 5th of 2021. In the 5 days after July 5th, a lot of people was fired in Italy, but this one, of course, was the most striking, because it was almost 500 workers, and the factory was economically healthy. So they didn't have any economic problem. So unexpected layoffs communicated via email. They were supposed, like, the owners supposed, as in Birmingham, they would have had, it happens, and people would look for other jobs. Instead, in Campi Bisenzio, because of a long history of unionization and radical unionization, what they do is that they send to each other some WhatsApp messages. They go to the gates and they occupy the factory. And they basically, the argument was, we want our jobs back. Okay, and you have, like, the first phase of the GKN case, so up until the end of 2021, more or less, is a successful example of a good union mobilization in case of shutting down factories. Of course, the excuse was delocalization. So they wanted to sell machinery, and the machinery is still there. But what is interesting is that the way the establishment in Italy tried to frame these layoffs was, we need to have ecological transition is the mobility sector. Private electric cars are easier to be constructed. They require less workers. So there will be firings, okay? And in their broadsheet, Il Sole 24 Ore is not a broadsheet like, a tabloid. It is the voice of Confindustria, which is the union of owners in Italy, and they said, you wanted Greta, you said Greta was good, now see what it means, okay? Your job evaporates. And so there was part of the union, some unions were actually almost going to agree with this reading, but the Factory Collective, again, a structure which existed before 2021, from the very beginning, at least theorized the need for an organic alliance with the climate justice movement in Italy. So they didn't buy that rhetoric. And this is from an interview I made with one of the workers there. And I think, other than numbers and the fact that they looked positively at the mobilizations of the Italian climate justice movement since 2019, is that he says all the great cycles of historical mobilization have coincided with a general effervescence in society, which feeds into workers' conflict and vice versa. So basically, this collective recognizes in climate justice not the main dividing line of society, but the movement which, better than others, encapsulate the political translation of that political line. So they are perfectly aware that the ecological crisis is much broader than the climate crisis. But the climate movement has been the only one, at least in the global north, to get to a mass level in 2019. And for them, the mass level was the political capital of the movement they had to tap into, okay? In order to get strength and to give, let's say, depth of class analysis. And you can see, I mean, here, that interview I did in December 2021, okay, when the need for convergence was stated, but convergence wasn't happening. There was an overlapping, like, you know, the two movements had sympathy for one another, but they didn't talk. In the spring of 2000, from the spring to, in 2022, basically that need got satisfied, okay? And we had three huge demos, and those demos actually, you know, the interesting trajectory is that at first it was GKN Collective and Fridays for Future, and then the Network for Food Sovereignty, and then Organized Unemployed, and then. Okay, there was not just a converging dynamic, but an expanding dynamic, part of which is the process of internationalization that happened in 2023. Okay, translation of pieces, they call it Insorgiamo Tour, because I mean, they travel throughout Italy to talk about their dispute, but also to try to build connections with other smaller disputes in Italy, and they started to do that also at the European level. So first they went to Germany because GKN closed down at Mosel the biggest of their European factories. Then they went to the UK when it all started in Birmingham. Then they went to Switzerland, and in 2 days they will be, tomorrow actually, they will be in France. And when I said before, I will conclude in 2-3 minutes. When I said before that what the GKN Collective provided the climate justice with was a deepening of their class analysis, can be seen in this joint declaration, because just before every convergence demonstration, there was a joint declaration by GKN Collective, Fridays for Future, and the other organizers of the demo. This one is the second one, just before the climate social camp in Turin, and they start to introduce in the climate debate in Italy the issue of collective ownership of the means of production in order to overcome the climatic job blackmail, which is you want it greater, now you get fired. Okay, and I think this has been a turning point in the elaboration of climate justice movements in Italy, because from that moment on, they started to look actively for a relationship with other workers in other disputes, which were not immediately climatic or environmental or ecological, but they could be if seen in a certain way. And very quickly, just a few elements for collective discussion. The first, one of the things, the novelty, this dispute shown, and according to everybody, played a role in the, I mean, this situation is still happening. We just celebrated 2 years of occupation a month ago, was that a lot of experts, let's say, like, you know, PhD students, professors, engineers, as soon as they saw that they were looking for alliances with the climate justice movement, they actually offered their expertise to elaborate the plans of conversion for the reindustrialization processes. And that mixture of workers' knowledge and expertise actually was fundamental for the success, the partial success so far of the campaign. And so there are two plans. The first one, actually when the dispute was at a point in which public intervention could have solved that, And so the plan basically said, we want to stay in the automotive sector, but we want to produce axle shaft for a nationally owned value chain of buses, electric buses, and they started to build relationship with workers in the, basically, objectively nationalized, but then managed privately, factories who produces buses. And so they incorporated a critique of private car mobility in their plan, and that was an element of novelty. The second conversion plan, 2023, ratified the situation. So basically the state did not intervene, so they either settled for some social compensations or they had to find another way to reindustrialize, and they launched this workers cooperative. Right now they are producing cargo bikes for other solidary economy actors in Italy. And then there is this low impact batteries. It's controversial, we can talk about that. But the main point is that they incorporated the colonial aspect of climate justice in Italy, saying, like, we will produce batteries only under the condition that critical minerals are not extracted from the south. And this, yesterday during the round table, we were discussing about this, and I think this provides, it's the ground with this. So, to conclude, in Italy at least, the GKN dispute has incorporated, in my opinion, the right way of politicizing the ecological field, which has its roots in the yellow vest in France. And so when they talk about the ecological transition, they ask who pays for the transition, and it has to be those who are more responsible for the problem and who have benefited in some cases for that. And who decides? And here we have, I think, an originality, not just in Italy, but at least in Europe. The social strength comes from workers' mobilization, but the vision needs to come from climate justice, because climate justice embodies and incorporates the dividing line I was talking before, and that's the way they pose the issue of ecological planning. Thank you very much, and sorry I went a little long.